Sorry for a bit of a delay. We've had a few sound issues, but I think we've got them resolved. Welcome this evening. I'm David Colburn with the Graham Center. We're particularly pleased to be co-sponsoring this event tonight with the Political Science Department. And I'd like to thank Michael Martinez, Chairman of the Political Science Department, and Aida Hozick, who worked with us and arranged most of the program tonight. And we're deeply appreciative for her work on this. We have 4 distinguished panelists this evening to talk about Obama's second term and particularly the prospects for immigration reform. Essentially, the way we're going to do this is they'll talk in a certain order. I'll introduce them in that order. And then somebody will walk around the room, and I think you've got little cards that give you an opportunity to ask questions. We can't pass the mics around in this room, so if you'll give your questions to one of the people that come by your aisle, we'll collect them, and then at the end of the evening, I will ask them a series of questions that you have raised and expressed interest in. So again, thank you for being here. Thanks for joining us on this important topic. Our speakers this evening are Larry Dodd, who is the Manning J. Dower Eminent Scholar Chair of the Political Science Department. Professor Dodd, as some of you know, is a very distinguished author. He's written many books, most recently Learning Democracy, Citizen Engagement, and Electoral Choice, 1990 to 2001, with Leslie Anderson. Thinking About Congress, Essays on Congressional Change in 2012, and the 10th edition of his book, Congress Reconsidered, co-edited with Bruce Oppenheimer in December of 2012. Dr. Philip Williams, next to Professor Dodd on my right. Professor Williams is the director of the Center for Latin American Studies. He received his MPhil in Latin American Studies from Oxford University and his DPhil in Politics from Oxford University. And he has done an extraordinary job as director of the Center for Latin American Studies. He recently co-authored a book called Living Illegal, The Human Face of Unauthorized Immigration, which draws on several years of research on Latin American immigrants and their experiences in the United States South. Lynn Leverty is Associate Director of the Askew Institute on Politics and Society. She's also a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Science. She served as a national consultant on immigration issues, and her major areas of research are in public administration, ethics, immigration, women in politics, and public policy. Last but not least is one of our students, Diego Garcia, a senior at the University of Florida, majoring in political science and nuclear engineering. Interesting combination there, Diego. After immigrating to the United States from Colombia 12 years ago, Diego and his family have been wrestling with the challenges surrounding the current immigration system. In the past 2 years, Diego has been an advocate for immigration reform and spoken to policy leaders both at the state and national level. Please welcome our panel this evening, if you would. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Colburn. So my role here tonight is as someone who is not a specialist in the area of immigration, but a specialist in American politics, I think we go now, and particularly the American Congress, as well as legislatures elsewhere in the world. And what I want to do tonight is to provide a context in which to understand the prospects for immigration policy in the Obama administration. And obviously, since you know American politics, you're living it just like I'm living it. The question is, amid the highly polarized and divided government we have in this country right now, is anything at all possible? Can Congress pass any kind of policy, much less a potentially controversial immigration policy? And so it's a good question to ask. We're in the midst of highly polarized politics, highly divided politics. Last Congress, one of the most divided and least productive of all Congresses in the last century or so. The same cast of characters is present in Congress and in national politics. Have President Obama into his second term, the same president, Democrat. We have a Democratic Senate. Harry Reid is the same majority leader. McConnell as the minority leader. We have a Republican House, with Boehner as Speaker and Pelosi as minority leaders. We have the same exact setup we had in the last Congress, the least productive of modern times. Any reason, therefore, to expect progress in those stances? Secondly, we have a special kind of divided government right now in this country. It's what is called quasi-divided government, and that makes a huge difference. We normally think of divided government as being the president of one party controls the presidency, the other party controls Congress. And when we have divided government, most times that's what we have. What we have right now is one party controlling one chamber of Congress, the other party controlling the president, and the other chamber of Congress. When you have that kind of arrangement, quasi-divided government, you have the situation which, since the elective Senate came along, has been the least productive context for the production of policy of any context in Congress. We do okay with pure divided government, by and large. We often do quite well with united party government. But when we have quasi-divided government, we have extremely low productivity. That seems to be because the party that only controls one chamber and not the presidency believes that the president and the other chamber of the other party will get the credit for legislation, and that they will themselves not really benefit all that much from policy being passed. And so they have lots of incentive to try to sabotage, looking to the next election, hoping the public blames the party of the president for the lack of policy, and that will benefit the minority party. That strategy has been the strategy followed by the last Republican House of Representatives. It was also the strategy followed by Democrats in the 1980s, when Reagan was president and he had a Republican Senate. So it's not just a partisan thing here. It's a characteristic of that logic. So when you combine the same cast of characters in terms of the leaders, and you combine quasi-divided government and high polarization in politics as we have today, that is a really poisonous situation to try to have any kind of major policy. That is then added to by other factors, and you know these, but let me bring them to your attention. Right now, we have a fiscal crisis continuing to confront us, if you haven't noticed that. You haven't yet looked at your tax statements coming in and read the newspaper about what's coming up in March. In March, we're likely to have the government run out of money under current fiscal arrangements and possibly have a government shutdown. We also possibly will have the sequestration of all domestic and defense spending outside of entitlements programs. So we face enormous problems physically, by and large a contrived problem. This is not something that is happening through natural events, but through political calculations. You add to that the fact then that in the last 2 to 3 months, a situation that looked extremely complex for the president and Congress has become much more complex. When the election was over, my co-editor and I were finishing up Congress Reconsidered, and we wrote in the final chapter, written immediately after the election, that we thought that immigration would be the top priority of the new Congress, and if they focused on that, it might be the one thing that would happen. But look at what happened surrounding the election. Hurricane Sandy hit, devastated the Northeast, and suddenly we're not only concerned about rebuilding, but we're also concerned about global warming. And then we had the enormous tragedy in Connecticut, which has transfixed all of us and focused our attention on gun control. And so suddenly, instead of immigration being the front and center issue, because we might finally have a window of opportunity to confront it, we have global warming and gun control, 3 biggies. So that greatly complicates the situation for the president, the Democratic Party in pushing immigration, as well as for the Republican Party and those there who support immigration. It makes it difficult to focus. And then we have a third thing, and that is we have a very problematic House Republican Party. Both parties go through these kinds of problems over the decades, but the Republicans are having a big problem right now. It's not clear whether the party has a leadership structure internally that can organize it and focus it in any kind of constructive fashion. Speaker Boehner has opposed many of the things his party has had him do over the last several years and would have led otherwise, but he doesn't have control of the party. But it's not clear that anyone else does. The election has left, consequently, that party in some disarray such that Speaker Boehner cannot keep the bargains he's on the verge of making, much less get his members to do his own will. So that creates a very problematic situation, not just for Obama and not just for Reid, but also for Minority Leader McConnell of the Republican Party. So to be realistic with you, I have to say that it is entirely possible meltdown will occur over the next 3 to 6 months in the Congress, poisoning the atmosphere, and so that nothing can happen. That shouldn't surprise you. I wouldn't have any credibility sitting up here and saying what I'm about to say if I didn't acknowledge that to you, okay? It's entirely possible. God knows what will happen in March and April of this year with respect to the fiscal crisis. And if out of that comes some kind of major upheaval, it probably will poison the atmosphere in Congress and national politics, leaving us struggling to get to the 2014 elections. There is, however, another way to see our current situation, both short-term and a bit longer term. And that is to say, first of all, that the elections did really change something. You know, Obama wins, he wins a second term, he wins with a majority, and he wins with a substantial electoral college. That has given him clout. Moreover, the Democrats increased seats in the Senate and likewise increased seats in the House, although still a minority in the House. No one saw this coming. No one in January of 2012 would have voted on a sweep of this nature for the Democratic Party. That has given them wind in their sail, and that wind is aided by the fact that they were aided in this by the demographic shifts occurring in this country, particularly by the increasing role and turnout and power of minorities, including Hispanics, Latinos. And as a consequence of that, the party has a kind of momentum, it has a kind of credibility, and we've seen that in the last few weeks when the president negotiated the continuance of the tax cuts for the middle class. So the elections have changed things, and they've changed things in some important ways that could conceivably help with leadership activity in Washington. Secondly, the Republicans increasingly understand, at least many of them understand, what their situation is. Certainly Senator Mitch McConnell, the minority leader in the Senate, is very clear-eyed in looking at where national politics is right now, and of course he led the process of compromise with respect to the tax cut issue. But there's also evidence that even in the House of Representatives right now, there is awareness of the situation. And the situation I'm referring to is this, that if the Republican Party does not adapt and adjust on immigration, it is a permanent minority party over the long run, given demographics. It has to change. Its party survival is at stake. And so that creates a new situation. And then there is the rise of Marco Rubio as a Republican going against the thrust of his party in supporting immigration policy and making it, in a sense, the main part of his own potential campaign for the presidency. That is important. And it's important for the following kind of reason. Over the last 2.5 to 3, 4 years, amidst all of this division in Congress and so forth, there has begun to emerge a strategy that will work to enact important legislation. It only works occasionally, but it can work in particular on the major policy concerns. And that policy is this. You start legislation in the Senate. You work out a compromise between Reid and McConnell or possibly between the Vice President and McConnell, and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats unite behind that policy and pass it. Then you take the policy to the House of Representatives. Boehner cannot deliver a majority of his party, but with McConnell and the Republicans having supported the policy in the Senate, he can argue with his caucus to take the policy to the floor of the House and let it go to vote. That policy now exists as a possibility with the added strength that Marco Rubio, as a potential co-author, co-sponsor, and so forth, leading a policy charge through the Senate in league with Democrats, could conceivably put the House Republican Party in a position where Boehner could justifiably take it to the floor and thereby pass it. So these are some of the concerns. There does seem to be some potentiality here for a strategy whereby one could address immigration policy. We also can expect, very possibly, particularly if there are serious problems, for Obama to take this to the people, for him to use the campaign organization he put to place to take it to the people, and the people will weigh in. That means that meetings like this, discussing immigration policy and bringing it to the attention of the public locally throughout the country, may be a vital part 3 and 4 and 5 months down the road in terms of the possibility for immigration reform.
Thanks, Larry. 2 years ago, when my colleagues and I were writing the conclusion to Living Illegal, we were pretty pessimistic about the prospects for comprehensive immigration reform. During the lame duck session of Congress, following the 2010 midterm elections, the Democratic-led Congress failed to even pass the DREAM Act. After that, with an incoming Republican-controlled majority in the House and presidential elections gearing up, the outlook for comprehensive immigration reform looked bleak, to say the least. Nevertheless, we didn't want to end the book on a downer, on a pessimistic note, and so we decided to end the book with a message of hope from Benita Veliz, a young DREAM activist who had been brought to the United States without authorization by her Mexican parents at the age of 8. She had just graduated from St. Mary's University in San Antonio, was hoping to go on to law school, but was facing deportation after being stopped for a traffic violation. When she heard that the Senate had voted down the DREAM Act in 2010, she stated, "I am a strong believer in the philosophy that the last thing you should ever give up on is hope. I think that's the result of being in America. That's what America taught me." Last November, a few days after the elections, my colleagues and I were writing the epilogue for a new paperback edition of the book. And so we decided, well, it makes sense to start where we left off, with Benita. A few months earlier, on September 5th, we watched with anticipation as Benita took the stage of the Democratic Convention in Charlotte to address the delegates there. She told the delegates and millions of viewers, "I feel just as American as my friends or my neighbors." That night, Benita made history. It was the first time that a person of unauthorized status had addressed a major political convention. I think also her presence on the stage signified how far DREAM activists had traveled the last 2 years, as well as the courage of many undocumented immigrants like her to come out of the shadows and to speak publicly, courageously, exposing themselves to potential deportation. At the same time, Benita's appearance also highlighted the many challenges that she and other immigrants face. While Benita was one of the first cohort of Dreamers to qualify for deferred action under Obama's policy, which is known as the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, it represented only a temporary reprieve from deportation, not a permanent solution. And I tell the story of Benita because amidst all the political discussion and analysis of immigration, it's important not to lose sight of the fact that immigration reform fundamentally is about human beings, about policies that have the potential to affect the dreams and hopes of young people like Benita. Before discussing the prospects of comprehensive immigration reform, I think it's important to understand what sort of the principal components of comprehensive immigration reform would look like. And we can look back over the years. There have been many versions of comprehensive immigration reform that have been floated, including in 2005 and 2006, when it seemed that it was pretty close to passage. Usually it involves sort of three major components. The most controversial one that you hear about all the time is a pathway to legalization or citizenship. I think what's important to point out that the versions that have been proposed in recent years do not constitute an amnesty like the amnesty provisions of the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. All the versions essentially put forward an earned pathway to legalization or citizenship, so that undocumented immigrants who become eligible would have to pay a penalty, they would have to pay back taxes, they would have to undergo a very rigorous criminal background check, they would have to learn English, they would have to get in line to eventually become a citizen. There's also a question about who would qualify under such an earned pathway. Is it people who arrived a year ago, more than 2 years, 4 years? It's not clear where that the final criteria would be set. But what's clear is that in any sort of earned pathway program, that a significant percentage of undocumented immigrants will not qualify. So of the 10 to 12 million estimated undocumented immigrants, it could be easily 1 million or more that don't qualify under comprehensive immigration reform. The other sort of major component of comprehensive immigration reform usually has to do with a guest worker or temporary worker program, expanding or reforming those programs that already exist as a way of more adequately responding to labor demands in the United States economy. And usually they focus on what are sort of lower-end skilled workers that come through what are called the H-2 guest worker programs, and the higher-end skilled workers through the H-1 program. And again, many of these programs are very controversial, particularly the H-2 programs, because of the kind of abuses that take place. And then finally, and it's important to note that any kind of comprehensive immigration reform is going to include a significant enforcement component. There's no way that even during this political context, immigration reform is going to pass without that. And it's going to be an important component to bring along moderate Democrats and Republicans. And when I say enforcement, what does that mean? Well, it means increased spending on border enforcement, whether it's more border patrol or fencing. It refers to interior enforcement programs like secure community programs. It refers to enforcement at the workplace, whether it's through the expansion of the E-Verify program, or some people have talked about a biometric ID card. So enforcement is going to be a significant component of whatever kind of comprehensive immigration reform comes about. The question that Professor Dodd asked, is this a historic window of opportunity? One thing I think is important to note, if you look back over the last 100 years, major immigration policy has usually taken place about every 20 to 30 years. And the last major overhaul was in 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act. So if history is any guide, we're sort of about due for a major overhaul. What I'm going to do very briefly in the time that I have is just address some of the factors that seem to favor the possibility of comprehensive immigration reform being passed by this Congress. And then Dr. Leverty, after I raise your hopes, she's going to dash your hopes by telling us why comprehensive immigration reform has been and still is very difficult to pass. And many of my points really sort of overlap and I think reinforce some of the points that Professor Dodd made. The first, obviously, is the 2012 election and the Latino vote. And I think for everyone and for many political commentators and political leaders on both sides, it was a huge wake-up call. It was a huge wake-up call to the country. The importance of the Latino vote can't be underestimated. As we know, depending on which polls you look at, Obama won between 70 and 75% of the Latino vote. Significant increase over his vote in 2008 amongst Latinos. The Latino vote was a key component to his winning coalition in several crucial swing states, including Colorado, Florida, Nevada, and even the state of Virginia. In Florida, Obama won nearly 60% of the Latino vote. Latino voters made up 17% of the total electorate, compared with 14% just 4 years ago. One thing that's also important to know, though, is Obama's support amongst Latinos was very much tied to the issue of immigration. And while jobs and the economy were the number one issue for Latino voters, just like other Americans, immigration was the number two issue for Latinos. And those of you who are Latinos, you know that immigration is an intensely personal issue for Latinos, because many Latinos have family members or friends who are very much affected by immigration policy. So it's an intensely personal issue. And the fact that Governor Romney, during the Republican primaries, made comments referring to calling for self-deportation, supporting the controversial Arizona law, SB 1070, coming out against the DREAM Act, these statements during the Republican primary alienated huge sectors of the Latino electorate. In contrast, despite the fact that Obama was unable to deliver on comprehensive immigration reform during his first term, what was important was his decision to implement the program I referred to before, DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. That was a huge issue in the sense that, as I said, it was not a permanent solution. It was a temporary reprieve. But if you look at the polling data, amongst some sectors of the Latino electorate, it generated much more enthusiasm. Obama in January was in some trouble with the Latino electorate, and that decision to implement DACA actually did a lot to galvanize Latino voters. Why? Because it wasn't just cutting another campaign ad. It was actually a concrete action that, while it was temporary, it at least gave some young people the possibility to apply for a work permit, and now in some states to also apply for a driver's license. Now that Obama has been reelected and seems to have his mojo back, Latino leaders expect action. And just to quote one Latino leader, "The sleeping Latino giant is awake and it's cranky. We expect action on immigration reform, no more excuses, no more obstruction." So obviously I think the elections, Latino vote's important, and related to that, another factor, and Dr. Dodd referred to it, but I would call it Republican fear. Some top Republican leaders, it was mentioned Senator Marco Rubio, but others like Jeb Bush, Lindsey Graham, they have come out publicly voicing concern that the Republican Party faces the prospect of permanently losing the Latino demographic, just like it's lost the African American vote. And as a result, it would never be able to return to majority status. So for these Republicans, they see immigration reform as a strategy of wooing back sectors of the Latino electorate that they've lost. And even more important is the fact that now some of these same leaders are coming out and saying that they would support an earned pathway to citizenship. It was important that last week, Senator Marco Rubio actually, for the first time, shifted his position. Prior to last week, he was against any kind of pathway to citizenship. Now he says he's willing to accept one, albeit a long and winding path. The last thing I would say is that America has changed profoundly in the last 5 years. For all of us who were paying attention, America's growing diversity was very much on display during this recent inauguration. And as America becomes more diverse, political leaders find it much more difficult to use polarizing and derogatory language to deal with the issue of undocumented immigration. Just on Monday, Governor Jan Brewer of Arizona gave her State of the State address, calling for combining the rule of law with human compassion in overhauling the immigration system. This is the same Governor Brewer who used such derogatory and offensive language in her support of SB 1070 just a few years earlier. American public opinion also is now, it seems, overwhelmingly in support of the DREAM Act and comprehensive immigration reform, including a pathway to citizenship. There was a New York Times poll that was released yesterday. 60% of Americans support a pathway to citizenship, including a majority, 53% of Republicans. And I believe that much of this change in public opinion is a result of efforts by DREAM activists and others like Diego here, who's going to speak. They have brought a compelling human face to the debate over immigration. And for us, I think they have pointed a way to a much more humane immigration system, which finally begins to live up to the evolving American identity and our place in the world. Thank you.
And now we move to the dark side. Although I will say at the beginning of this that I do think that the DREAM Act, a version of the DREAM Act, will pass this Congress. I don't see any way that that will not happen, so I will at least start off with a positive before I turn to the dark side. I have spent years working on legislation in Congress and at the state level on immigration. So I will just list some of the issues that I have run into over these years and that I think will come forward again. They are always underlying any discussion on immigration. The first, of course, is security. We changed our immigration system significantly after 9/11 for good reason. The hijackers entered this country legally. They overstayed their visas, but we have a legitimate concern about that. We have almost finished the border fence, but we now have rumblings from the Southwest that the single layer fence is not enough, that we need a double layer fence, that the smugglers and drug smugglers, gun smugglers, and people smugglers are smarter than we are, and they figured out how to get over and under the fence. We probably could have told them that beforehand, but and I have a concern about the fact that every time that we start talking about increased enforcement, the idea of a national ID card comes back up. And for some reason, although many countries in the world have this, the United States has been, citizens have been diametrically and very steadfastly in opposition to that. I think funding is going to be the huge issue, however. We are facing the debt ceiling, we are facing a huge push to reduce federal spending, and immigration reform would be expensive. We have a huge backlog right now in persons waiting to be processed. People often end up in an undocumented status, not because they've done anything wrong, but because our system is long, it is complicated, it is difficult, and it is going to require additional funding to deal with the people who we are already trying to process. Additional visas. By the way, we have 185 different kinds of visas in this country, which is probably adds to the expense. So I wonder if adequate funds will be available to process additional persons, because obviously, as Phil said, this would be a rigorous process. It would require extensive criminal background checks, extensive documentation, extensive interview process, and all of those kinds of things. And all of that is expensive because it requires human interventions. Computers cannot do those things. You have to have personnel to do it. Now, I think the job situation is also going to play into this. I know that the Chamber of Commerce and other groups are working really hard to increase the number of skilled visas allowed and to allow foreign graduate students who have studied here to stay, which makes sense. We have an investment in these people. It makes great sense. But we have a lot of people who are underemployed or unemployed. And there is going to be opposition, even though the Chamber of Commerce and other organizations support it, to allowing more skilled visas. The dark side that I've often seen, and I know that Phil has when he wrote Living Illegal, There are employers in this country who prefer undocumented labor. Why? Because it's cheaper and working conditions do not have to be monitored as closely. And so we have seen that even in Alabama, where many of the undocumented workers left the state after the Alabama law was passed, much of which has not been upheld by federal judges, that jobs were not filled, and there was certainly a demand for those persons to return. The final point I've made is that there is a mean streak in Congress. I agree that they are concerned about the Latino vote is certainly important, but last year the Violence Against Women Act and the Trafficking Victims Protection Act were not reauthorized for the first time in more than a decade. And they were not reauthorized partially because of concern about services for undocumented women and the number of visas who were allowed for victims of trafficking and violence. So I'm concerned that if there is not, these traditionally bipartisan programs for vulnerable people will not be reauthorized, it's going to be even more difficult to enact comprehensive immigration reform. That said, I hope Phil's right. It's hard to be on the dark side, and I will turn it over to Diego.
First, I want to start by thanking the Political Science Department and the Bob Graham Center for Public Service for inviting me to speak today. As mentioned, I am a senior here at the University of Florida studying political science and nuclear engineering, and also an immigrant who has lived here in this immigration system for the past 12 years. So my story begins nearly 14 years ago when a group of narco-terrorists detonated a car bomb around about 10 minutes away from where my family and I lived in Bogota, Colombia. This indiscriminate act of violence so close to home was too much for my parents to take. They longed for a life of opportunity for me, for my sister, for my brother, a life where walking down the street and being blown up was not a concern, a life where you could get a decent job after college, and those were not reserved for the wealthiest and most connected families. So in September of 2000, my family left everything behind and migrated to the United States under a 5-year limited stay visa, which was the best visa available to us through the help of a family lawyer. My family and I lived in the United States for 5 years in Miami, Florida. We went to school, learned to speak English, made friends, started a business. And although times were tough financially, it was a new, marvelous beginning, beaming with the promise of opportunity that my family had sacrificed everything to obtain. It was at the end of those first 5 years, however, that I finally learned what it really meant to live under the current broken immigration system. We were sent back to Bogota to plead for an extension of our current visa to continue our life in the United States. All the sacrifice and effort of those 5 years was suddenly condensed to a 10-minute conversation with an immigration official who could deny or approve our claim on a whim. My father's business, the stipulation that supported our status, was barely staying afloat, but the immigration officer definitely took pity on us in granting us the extension. After that day, I understood what it really meant to live under the immigration ticking time clock. Wrestling with the system for the next 5 years proved an even more challenging experience. My father's visa only covered my siblings and I until we were 21. When my brother turned 21, he had to go back to Colombia. He was looking forward to going to college, and being an illegal immigrant when his status expired basically denied him of that. So after sharing a room with my brother all my life, he was gone, and our family was essentially ripped apart. Similarly, when that fate came to knock on my door, I had to scurry to find enough resources to obtain a student visa for myself, since I was already here, and I barely made the deadline, was barely spared. And in my sister's case, she was fortunate enough to fall under President Obama's DACA, or Deferred Action, when she turned 21 last summer. She had decided to forego continuing her education and live an illegal life when her status expired, since moving back to Colombia, a country she barely remembered as a 9-year-old and whose language she could barely write, was just simply not an option at all. And so, although my siblings and I had grown up in America gone to elementary, middle, and high school here, rooted for the Miami Dolphins, celebrated the 4th of July. We still lived under the constant anxiety of knowing that our entire lives were threatened to fall apart every couple of years. So last summer, I've had enough of waiting around for someone in Washington to realize how incredibly damaging these laws were for the lives of so many people like me. So I traveled to Washington, D.C., and became an activist in this issue. I spoke to the offices of Senator Marco Rubio, Congressman David Rivera, Raul Labrador, and Luis Gutierrez. As I made my ruckus around D.C., I was even able to tell my story to Justice Sotomayor, who had served as a major source of inspiration for me as I faced every obstacle the immigration system had posed in front of me. I had been paying attention to this issue politically as far as I can remember. The defeat of the DREAM Act in the Senate in 2010 was one of the most painful experiences in my life. Politically, this issue used to have bipartisan support. Back in 2001, the DREAM Act was proposed by current Republican Senator Orrin Hatch and Democratic Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois. By 2010, even Senator Hatch did not support it. When the bill cleared the House, it was filibustered by Republicans in the Senate, despite receiving 55 yes votes, although only one was Republican. In the conservative backlash that characterized those years, Republicans had turned a blind eye to families in my condition. In 2011, at the Republican primary MSNBC debate, moderator Jose Diaz-Balart asked the candidates what they would do to address the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the country, and not one of them was willing to do immigration reform. Immigration had reached an all-time low in Republican politics. But elections have consequences. And after employing negative, derogatory anti-rhetoric during the primary, Governor Romney received a mere 27% of the Hispanic vote. And now, in this post-election world, immigration reform has the best chances of happening than at any time in the past decade. Republicans sense a real rift that was created between their party and the Hispanic voters as an aftershock of the extreme deportation policy positions and anti-immigrant rhetoric that dominated the party lexicon in this issue for the past several years. On the other hand, Democrats promised such reform in the election and were rewarded with strong Hispanic and immigrant voter support. Immigration reform is not a gift to the Hispanic community, as so many in the opposition would like to paint it as. It is an endemic, countrywide problem. The current system is broken. It is clear that the deportation of 11 million undocumented immigrants is not realistic or an affordable option. The current visa system does more to tear families apart than it does to harness the potential of the immigrant influx. Even playing by all the rules in the system can land you in a rut where the only option is to return to a country you barely remember, even if you're a scientist or an engineer. Groups such as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Southern Baptist Convention, Citigroup, and the Conservative American Enterprise Institute have all embraced taking this issue on as soon as possible. The Center for American Progress estimates that comprehensive immigration reform would yield at least $1.5 trillion in GDP growth in the next 10 years. Reforming the immigration system will not only re-energize our economy, but also provide a wealth of tax revenues as people come out of the shadows. An immigration task force by the Center of Foreign Relations found that the exploitation of the population of immigrants living here illegally was depressing wages by as much as 12% in some areas. This study also found that the current immigration system had lost all credibility for respecting the law. It provides security risks, weakens labor laws, strains relations with neighbor states, and leaves a bright pool of exponential potential untapped and living in fear. The problem is not only immoral, but fiscally irresponsible. In my own life, I have seen employers exploit workers by the power that a work visa gives a company over these people, my mother being one of those workers. I've also seen people who had been hurt in car accident, needing medical attention, flee the scenes in fear of being deported. I have witnessed people cheat the system by stealing Social Security numbers to try to find work. The truth is that the current immigration system is built to incentivize behaviors that are detrimental to our society on a wide scale. In my opinion, living as an immigrant here, there are several things that the immigration reform must do. First, it must provide a path to citizenship for the 11 million illegal immigrants who are here currently living in the shadows. This is the heart of the issue and also the most politically contentious. Whether this is done fast-tracked through a delayed residency or made to include the assessment of penalties, Republicans and Democrats must find compromise on this issue. Second, policymakers should not forget to address the legal status of so many immigrants, legal immigrants like myself, who have played by all the rules simply to shift from one costly status to another with no avail. I believe Congress should provide an accelerated permanent residency and eventual citizenship for this group of immigrants. Third, Congress should only seek solutions that keep families together and not tear them apart. Legislation that decides who gets legal status or not within a family unit is shameful and should not be considered. I fear that the only result of a piecemeal approach to reform will be more fragmented families. If Congress wants to tackle smaller parts of the subject at a time, it must write laws that keep families together. And fourth, provide a new framework of legal immigration, a system that works for the betterment of American global competitiveness and for the foundations of our economy. An open, navigable system that responds to the market's labor needs, that abolishes arbitrary quotas, attracts skilled immigrants, rewards higher education, and provides a national system of employment verification. A system like this will shock and decrease illegal migration practices. As a result, protecting our borders will be a much easier and manageable concern that can focus on catching drug traffickers instead of families looking for a better life. This issue will only be solved in the long run once a system is in place that has all the correct incentives for legal immigration, a system that serves to enhance the life of the immigrant as they contribute to strengthen the United States. It is time to recognize that our existing system of immigration is self-defeating and requires President Obama's full leverage and support. I have high hopes that Congress and the President will take this issue up early in 2013 and bring an end to the anxiety and misery that this dark period of bad policy has wrought on families like mine. Thank you.
Thank you all for a terrific series of presentations. The first question I've got here is, will a law giving Cubans 20,000 visas per year plus green cards to every Cuban who steps on American soil be in the mix for immigration reform? Not all at once now.
I guess the short answer is no. You know, I think there's so many issues that are controversial in negotiating comprehensive immigration reform. I don't see that as being included in the discussion. But the question about besides the 20,000 quota, what was it?
The question, besides the visas, is includes the green cards to every Cuban who steps on American soil.
In terms of reversing that policy?
No, will it be continued or will it be a part of the immigration reform package?
I'm sure it's going to be continued. I think what's interesting is now the fact that there's been some slight change in Cuba's migration policy, the fact that there's no longer the exit visa that's required. But you know, some people are suggesting, well, maybe Cubans need to be treated the same as other immigrants, but you know, it's a policy that's been in effect for about a week. But I think the politics of messing or tinkering with those policies are detrimental for most politicians, I would imagine. Do you want to?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's certainly inequities in the current program, but I think that there are so many bigger challenges involved in comprehensive immigration reform that probably that will not be changed.
Okay. Another question, can you be a little more specific about why Republicans are running scared on the immigration issue?
I think it's pretty obvious if you look at the results of the recent elections. I'd be running scared if you know, my party, the standard-bearer party, couldn't even garner 30% of the Latino vote. Lost the Latino vote in Florida, although Obama did win it in 2008. And anyone who has any knowledge of the demographic trends in this country, you can't lose completely write off the African American vote and then completely write off the Latino vote and expect to be a majority party anytime in the future. So that's why I'd be running scared.
You just need to look at the state of California. In the early 1990s, the Republican Party and Governor Wilson played the immigration card and lost the Hispanic Latino vote in California more or less permanently, and the Democrats have been able to consolidate control, now supermajority control there. I think also you look at the state of Texas. Texas is rapidly shifting, and if Texas goes to a majority-minority state, the Electoral College is all over for the future.
How could U.S. policies relative to Latin America change to make life in Latin America more livable and thereby stem the flow of immigration to the United States?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that the current system, as it stands right now, has a lot of flaws. And just like in my situation, there's a lot of visas that you age out of with your family. The visa that I came with, E1, allowed me and my family to live here for 10 years, through all my formative years, and still gave me no path forward. It actually told me that as soon as I turned 21, living here all my life, I had to go back, and I had to scurry to find a new status. So I think that there needs to be a system in place that allows for for kids like me who come here in an early age and make America their home to stay here. I think also it needs to work with responding to the labor market and what the labor needs, and allowing the people that want to look for a better life in the United States to come here and be able to fill the jobs that the United States needs. I saw in Salinas, the United Farm Workers put a post asking for people that they needed jobs to get crops out of the field in the economy they have right now, and no one showed up. So those things are needed. Also in taking care of the elderly in homes, those are areas that need workers too, but people are not willing to work those in our economy right now. But I can tell you there's a lot of people in Latin America who definitely would take the opportunity, because they're not only faced with economic hardship there, but also violence, everyday violence. And even just getting rid of that aspect is enough to venture a new life and sacrifice everything.
Well, I think what you're talking about here is the push factors that move people to leave a country and move to another country. We are seeing democratization in some areas of Latin America. We're also seeing problems such as in Mexico, where the drug cartels are taking over significant parts of the country, and we're even beginning to accept some people from Mexico on asylum and refugee status, which we have not done before. I think it's very hard for the United States to change conditions in other countries. We can think about better policies. We certainly have supported governments that we should not have supported in years past in Latin America. But our efforts in other nations to try to increase economic development and things have not always worked out the way that we would like to. And foreign aid has never been one of those things that the American public has been terribly excited about providing.
I would just add to that comprehensive immigration reform is no silver bullet, that what we're talking about here are ways to better manage our immigration system and migration flows. And the points that Lynn brought up about development ultimately depends on the level of development of Latin America beginning to resemble that of the United States. You know, we're a part of a regional integration scheme with Mexico called NAFTA, but it only allows for the free flow of capital and goods. If you compare it with the regional integration in Europe, it also allows for the free flow of human beings. But to be able to be successful with that regional integration scheme, the wealthier nations in Europe had to invest heavily in the poor nations to bring them up closer to the development level of the wealthier nations. Are we here in the United States willing to do that with Mexico or Central America? But I think a counterexample is the case of Brazil, which economically it's now the sixth largest economy in the country, And there's evidence that Brazilians, many who migrated here during the economic troubles of the 1980s and 90s, many have returned to Brazil because of the booming economic situation there. So a lot of it depends on Latin America, their economies and levels of development coming up closer to the United States. But again, the point that Lynn made, to what extent is the United States able to affect that change? And our track record, if you look at NAFTA, NAFTA, as a result of NAFTA, we essentially flooded cheaply produced American corn and destroyed maize producers in southern Mexico. If you look at where Mexican migrants were coming from before the recent economic recession, it was from southern Mexico, from the maize-growing communities that have been totally wiped out because of our NAFTA policy.
It seems like this session's focused heavily on Latin America. Where do other parts of the globe fit into the immigration reform picture?
Well, certainly, of course, the highest number of immigrants coming to the United States, highest demand, is the Caribbean and Latin America. And we have to put the Caribbean in there, especially for Florida, where very many of our newcomers come. Demand in other parts of the world differs. We certainly have demand, not so much from Europe, but and not as much in Africa, certainly in areas of the Middle East, and you have to think of Asia. We do have an enormous demand of both legal and undocumented immigration from China. Comprehensive reform will have to take that into account. I think what we're talking about at the moment when we talk about comprehensive immigration reform is, while we've used examples from Latin America, we are talking about a worldwide program in which visas may be even more evenly spread out than they are today, more available to a wider variety of countries. We have this very strange thing called the diversity visa lottery at the moment, which distributes visas to immigrants in non-traditional sending countries. And it is truly a lottery. It's sort of like, the Florida lottery, except you win a visa instead of money. And that kind of thing really needs to be better distributed and better managed. And even travel visas. Right now, if you're in Brazil or China, it may take you 6 or 8 months to be able to get a visa simply to go on vacation in the United States.
I always try to catch myself to not go that route and make it about Latin America and the Hispanic community, because there are so many people that I know, engineers also, that have fallen out of status. And a lot of these people, they travel legally to the United States, and then they overstay their stay. And so a lot of times the border dispute is puts the relationship in Mexico in spotlight, but there are a lot of people like that too, that just don't find a way forward and they decide to stay. But I think that the focus has been nationally about the Hispanic community because it was a political driver for this to come up. And it was the demographic changes that have happened in the past 5 years, and how sometimes I get a little offended when people say that the Hispanic community basically follows like sheep, where the policy that favors them goes. I think that it's a very concerted effort for the Hispanic community to rally behind one party to get its policy forward. And so noticing that even states like Texas could go purple soon if some type of correction in the Republican Party isn't addressed, then they realize that maybe if immigration reform is such a rallying call for the Hispanic community, if we're able to get this out, it might be able to diversify across the parties.
Well, thank you all. I think this has been a wonderful evening, and you've done a terrific job in giving us insight on this topic. Thank you very much.